Imagine it. A sky tinged with a faint, ruddy hue. A horizon stretching further than the eye dares to wander. Wind sweeping across an endless desert of ochre sands and fractured rock. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just silence. And yet, what if this silence is not empty, but echoes with the ghosts of a civilization long since extinguished? Mars. For centuries, humanity has gazed at this red neighbor, suspended in the velvet dark of our night sky, and wondered, is it dead, or has it lived before? We have always sought reflections of ourselves in the heavens. When early astronomers trained their crude telescopes upon Mars, they thought they saw canals, artificial lines scarring its surface, proof, they claimed, of an intelligent race sculpting rivers across a dying world. Writers seized upon the idea, and Mars became the grand stage of our collective imagination. Alien invaders, dying civilizations, war machines descending upon Earth. It was a mirror of our fears and our hopes, a cosmic canvas upon which we painted stories of triumph and collapse. But beneath the fiction, a question still lingers. What if Mars was once alive, not merely with microbes or algae, but with a civilization, thinking beings, building, dreaming, and inevitably falling? Before we go any deeper, I'd love to know what your listening space feels like right now. Has night already settled around you like a familiar embrace, or are you still bathed in whatever light the day has left? Kindly tell us in the comment section below. Wherever and whenever you are, we're meeting in this shared space of wonder, ready to explore ideas that live just beyond our everyday sight. If this unhurried journey of discovery feels like the kind of presence you've been seeking, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider giving this a like, subscribing to join us regularly, or passing it along to someone who might find solace in these gentle investigations. It's a simple thing, but it helps ensure these quiet conversations continue finding their way to people who need them. Think of it as keeping a candle burning in the window for other seekers. This first part of our journey does not begin with fanciful tales of little green men. It begins with geology, astronomy, and the patient story told by rock and dust. Yet, as we trace that story, a tantalizing possibility emerges, that Mars may not be the barren wasteland it appears, but a graveyard of something once greater. Mars is not as distant from us as it seems. In truth, it is the most Earth-like planet in our solar system. A day on Mars, called a sol, lasts just over 24 hours. Its poles are capped with ice. Its surface bears valleys, mountains, and canyons carved in ways eerily familiar to our terrestrial eye. Billions of years ago, it was wetter, warmer, more hospitable. We know this not by speculation, but through evidence gathered by orbiters and rovers, machines that crawl and fly, reading the language of stone. Imagine standing there 3 billion years past, a young sun burning more brightly, Mars clothed in not arid deserts, but on sprawling rivers and perhaps even oceans. Blue water reflecting a pink sky, clouds drifting overhead, the murmur of waves upon alien shores. If life could have taken root anywhere beyond Earth, here was fertile ground. And yet, what happened? Mars cooled. Its magnetic field failed, leaving it defenseless before the solar wind. Slowly, the atmosphere was stripped away, the oceans evaporated into space, and the once green world fell into red desolation. But what if, in that brief golden window, something extraordinary occurred? What if life arose not as simple microbes, but as a civilization, thinking beings, building, dreaming, and inevitably falling? We should be clear. Mainstream science has not uncovered ruins, temples, or skeletal remains on Mars. What we do have, however, are anomalies, curious shapes, strange formations, images that tempt the imagination. Most famously, the so-called face on Mars, a mesa in the Cydonia region that under certain lighting resembles a colossal humanoid visage. Flanking it, pyramid-like hills, weathered into uncanny geometry. NASA has long maintained that these are tricks of light and erosion, and perhaps they are. But to the human eye, trained over millennia to see patterns, the resemblance is difficult to dismiss. Even skeptics admit these formations make us look twice. For writers, researchers, and dreamers, they form the breadcrumbs of a tantalizing trail. If Mars once bore water and atmosphere, why not culture? Why not cities, technologies, and beings who looked at the stars much as we do now? This is the premise of our question, not to insist upon Martian civilizations as fact, but to ask, what if? The importance of such speculation is not whether it is immediately provable. It is in its capacity to expand our perspective. For if Mars, so near, so studied, so familiar, could once have supported a civilization, then the uniqueness of Earth collapses. We are no longer the solitary beacon of intelligence in the dark. We are part of a lineage, perhaps not the first, perhaps not the last. It is here that the story of Mars ceases to be about another world and becomes a mirror to our own. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall. Could Mars be the ultimate cautionary tale? Over the course of this series, we will walk along Martian valleys, sift through meteorites, peer beneath its frozen crust, and listen to the whispers of anomalies captured by distant cameras. We will weigh scientific evidence against speculation, balance what is known against what might yet be discovered, and entertain visions of a civilization that could have thrived there until Mars itself turned against it. For now, let us return to the silence of that red horizon, to the winds that scour dust across ancient plains, to the possibility that beneath those sands lie the remnants of builders, thinkers, and dreamers, perhaps not unlike ourselves. If such a civilization did exist, then its ruins are not merely Martian ruins, they are lessons, written in stone and dust, waiting for us to uncover. Lessons about fragility, about resilience, and about the precariousness of life balanced against the vastness of space. And so, we begin with a single question. What if Mars was not empty but inhabited? What if its silence is the silence of something lost? In the late 19th century, Mars became more than a distant speck of light in the heavens. It became a stage upon which imagination, science, and speculation performed together. To ordinary men and women, the red planet was no longer simply an object of curiosity. It was a mirror reflecting the human hunger for discovery and the tendency to see ourselves in places where perhaps we do not belong. The story begins in 1877. That year, Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli trained his telescope upon Mars during a particularly favorable opposition, when the planet and Earth were at their closest. Through the shimmering turbulence of the atmosphere, he noticed something remarkable. Dark markings stretched across the Martian surface. Straight, linear, and seemingly artificial, they stood apart from the irregular blotches one might expect of craters and hills. Schiaparelli described them as canali, channels. The translation of this simple word would prove decisive. Canali in Italian meant channels or grooves, a neutral description. But when the word leapt across into English, it was transformed into canals. That single linguistic shift carried with it all the weight of human industry, the hand of intelligent design. Suddenly, astronomers, journalists, and readers alike were confronted with the idea not of natural features, but of vast artificial waterways stretching across a world far from our own. The effect was electric. Newspapers seized the story, scientific journals debated it fiercely. Could it truly be that Mars was home to engineers laboring to channel water across a dying world? The timing was fortuitous. The Suez Canal had only been completed a few years earlier, an engineering marvel that had transfixed the public imagination. If humankind could carve waterways through deserts on Earth, why should Martians not do the same on their world? The notion did not remain confined to technical circles. Popular magazines were soon filled with dramatic illustrations of cities gleaming beneath domes of glass, linked by shimmering blue canals that stretched for hundreds of miles. Writers embroidered the picture further, suggesting that these canals were not merely feats of engineering, but the desperate measures of a civilization clinging to survival on an arid planet. To many, the canals of Mars were not just evidence of life, they were evidence of a tragedy in progress. Among the most passionate advocates of this idea was an American astronomer named Percival Lowell. In 1894, he built a grand observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, chosen for its high, dry air that offered clearer views of the heavens. From there, Lowell dedicated his career to mapping Mars. Night after night, year after year, he sketched what he saw through the eyepiece: networks of canals crisscrossing the Martian globe, geometric patterns that to him could not be the work of chance. Lowell went further than Schiaparelli. In his books, he argued that Mars was inhabited by an ancient, advanced civilization. These Martians, he suggested, had constructed the canals to transport precious water from the melting polar caps down to the equatorial regions, where they maintained their last strongholds of agriculture and life. To Lowell, this was not speculation, but evidence. He described it with such conviction that his words sparked a wave of fascination across the Western world. The idea of Martian civilizations entered literature and culture with explosive force. H.G. Wells imagined a desperate predatory race in The War of the Worlds, descending upon Earth to replenish their dying resources. Edgar Rice Burroughs spun tales of adventure upon a desert Mars populated by kingdoms, warriors, and flying ships in John Carter of Mars. To the public, Mars was alive. It was no longer a distant desert, it was a neighbor, inhabited by beings older and perhaps wiser, but locked in a struggle against planetary death. The canals were their monuments, and perhaps their last gasp. Yet science, as always, pressed forward. As telescopes improved in quality, the neat lines observed by Schiaparelli and Lowell began to blur. The canals dissolved into irregular markings, natural ridges, shadows, and the tricks of an eye straining to perceive detail beyond its limit. The harsh truth began to dawn. There were no vast artificial waterways, no engineered irrigation systems. Mars was not crisscrossed by canals, but scarred by geology. And yet, the idea refused to die. Even after astronomers declared the canals an illusion, the vision of an intelligent Martian race lingered in the popular imagination. It had burned too brightly, sunk too deeply into the cultural imagination to be extinguished by a few scientific corrections. More importantly, perhaps Lowell had been wrong in detail, but not in spirit. Mars may not be marked by canals, but it had once been wet. It had once flowed with rivers, been carved by streams, perhaps even embraced by oceans. Where there is water, there is always the possibility of life. And in that possibility lies the enduring allure of the red planet. If the age of canals fired our imagination, the 20th century brought a harsher clarity. Instruments sharpened, telescopes grew stronger, and with them, the illusion of Martian waterways was stripped away. By mid-century, the consensus was grimly pragmatic. Mars was barren, cold, airless, lifeless. The dream of Martian engineers had evaporated like the water we once believed flowed across their planet. Yet, dreams, once ignited, do not vanish so easily. Mars had burnt itself into our collective psyche. Even as scientists cooled the flames of speculation, culture fanned them once more. For Mars was more than a planet, it was a story. And stories, unlike canals, are not so easily erased. By the 1960s, humankind was finally preparing to touch the stars. Rockets thundered skyward, satellites circled the Earth, and whispers of visiting Mars were growing louder. Yet long before a human boot could step upon that ruddy soil, robotic eyes would go first. The question had shifted. It was no longer, are there canals? It was, is there anything at all? In 1965, NASA's Mariner 4 became the first spacecraft to fly by Mars. Its camera clipped just 22 images, grainy by today's standards, but each a revelation. They showed a cratered wasteland, eerily similar to the Moon. No seas, no canals, no glittering cities, just an ancient, pocked desert, silent and still. The impact was devastating to those who still clung to Lowell's dream. For many, it was the death knell of Mars as a living world. And yet, those little photographs, stark though they were, did not end the story. For others, they whispered something else. Yes, the surface was desolate, but look more closely, and you would see valleys, dry riverbeds, channels carved not by the hands of Martians, but by the force of flowing water. Not canals, but rivers. Ancient, long vanished, but undeniably there. This was the seed of a new vision. Perhaps Mars did not now host life, but what if it once had? What if the planet we see today is not the whole story, but only the epilogue of something far greater? The next decades brought new missions, each peeling away more of Mars's disguise. Mariner 9 in 1971 orbited the planet and revealed landscapes of staggering beauty. Vast canyons deeper and longer than any on Earth, colossal volcanoes rising higher than Mount Everest, plains scarred with channels and gullies. Here was a planet shaped by fire and flood, a world not always so barren, but one that had once been dynamic, restless, alive in its own way. The crowning jewel of these revelations was Vallis Marinaris, a canyon system so immense that it would stretch across the entire width of the United States. Its walls spoke of titanic forces, of rifts that had torn the planet's skin apart. And then there was Olympus Mons, a volcano the size of France, the tallest in the solar system. These were not the features of a dead, forgotten rock. They were the scars of a planet that had once burned with energy. To many, this strengthened the possibility that Mars had once been alive in more than a geological sense. Where there were rivers, there might have been lakes. Where there were lakes, there might have been oceans. And where there was water, there could have been life. The 1970s brought another milestone, the Viking missions. In 1976, Viking 1 and 2 landed softly upon Martian soil, the first to touch down and send back images from the surface. For the first time, humanity saw Mars not through the lens of speculation or telescope blur, but directly. The images were haunting. A rocky plain stretching to the horizon, sky tinted pink, dust clinging to the lander's legs. No ruins, no canals, no sign of Martians waving from the distance. But Viking carried more than cameras. It carried experiments, tests designed to detect life itself. Tiny scoops of soil were fed into miniature laboratories, searching for chemical traces that might reveal biological activity. The results were maddening. One experiment seemed to hint at reactions consistent with life. Others contradicted it. To this day, the Viking data remain ambiguous, tantalizing enough to fuel debate for decades, but never conclusive. If there was life, it was microscopic, hidden, clinging desperately to the margins, nothing like the grand civilizations Lowell had imagined. And yet, some argued, was that not expectation itself playing tricks on us once again? Perhaps the Martians had not been microbes nor engineers, but something in between. Creatures adapted to a world once warm and wet, before it dried into the desolation we now see. The silence of Viking left many disheartened, but it also shifted the question. We were no longer asking whether Mars teemed with cities or even microbes. We were asking, could it have once? What stories does this dust conceal? Could the relics of a civilization, not alive now, but long gone, be buried beneath the sand? Thus, a new form of Martian mystery began to emerge. Not the hope of greeting alien neighbors, but of uncovering alien history. A civilization not beside us, but behind us, lost in the dust, waiting for us to read its final chapter. At the close of the 20th century, Mars had become less of a dream and more of a riddle. The canals had faded, the hopes of bustling cities dissolved into dust, and yet the planet refused to give up its secrets. Each mission revealed a world that seemed determined to whisper rather than shout, offering hints, fragments, and questions that only deepened the mystery. If Lowell's vision of grand Martian engineers had collapsed, another possibility rose in its place. Perhaps Mars had once been alive, not in the present tense, but in the past. Not as a rival to human civilization, but as a forerunner, a shadow that came before us and vanished before we could know it. For beneath the dry deserts of Mars, there are scars that tell a story. Vast channels gouged into the surface, evidence of floods so immense that they make Earth's rivers seem like trickles. Ancient deltas, frozen in stone, mark the mouths of rivers that once emptied into lakes or seas. Mineral deposits, shaped only in the presence of liquid water, still linger as fossils of chemistry. These are not inventions of imagination, they are facts, measured and mapped by orbiters and rovers alike. The picture that emerges is striking. Mars, long ago, was not a barren wasteland we see today. It was a world of seasons, of rainfall, of rivers winding through valleys and lakes that stretched across wide basins, perhaps even oceans lapping at northern shores. Its sky may have been thicker, its atmosphere heavier, able to trap warmth and cradle water. If so, then the Martian past begins to look startlingly familiar. It begins to look like Earth. And on Earth, where water and time come together, life appears. It is one of the great lessons of biology. Life is tenacious. It takes root wherever it can. Boiling hot springs, Antarctic ice, the darkest reaches of the ocean floor. If Mars truly once enjoyed rivers and seas, why should life not have arisen there too? The question, then, is not whether Mars could have hosted life. The question is whether it hosted civilization. Civilization, after all, is not simply the presence of microbes. It is organization, culture, the shaping of environment to suit one's needs. It is language, technology, memory. Could Mars, in its younger days, have fostered such a thing? Skeptics argue it is unlikely. Civilization, even on Earth, is recent. Our species has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, but cities and writing are only a few thousand years old. Compared to the 4 billion years of Earth's history, civilization is the blink of an eye. Why then should Mars have achieved it? And yet there is a counterpoint. Mars, smaller and more fragile than Earth, may have had less time to waste. If its rivers and lakes endured only for a few 100 million years before fading, any life there would have been under pressure to adapt quickly or perish. Perhaps civilization did not require as long a preamble as it did on Earth. Perhaps necessity accelerated the path. If so, the question becomes tantalizing. What remains of such a civilization if it ever existed? Would we recognize it? On Earth, time erases almost everything. Wood decays, metal rusts, stone crumbles. Even entire cities vanish beneath jungle, sea, or sand in mere thousands of years. Civilizations older than 10,000 years are already ghosts to us. Mars has had not thousands, but billions of years to scour its surface. If there were ruins, they might now be buried beneath dust, eroded into unrecognizable forms, or shattered by meteor impacts. But Mars also offers a strange advantage. Unlike Earth, it is geologically quiet. Its crust does not shift with plate tectonics. It does not churn old rocks back into the mantle or recycle its surface with relentless rain and vegetation. A structure left on Mars a billion years ago, if sheltered, might still remain, weathered but present. Fossils of civilization could linger longer there than here. This is the paradox of Mars. It is a world that both destroys and preserves, a place where time has erased rivers but left their traces, erased seas but kept their shorelines, erased cities, if they existed, but perhaps left behind their shadows in stone. So the idea persists, not as fiction, but as possibility, that buried in the dust are relics not of nature, but of culture, patterns that speak not of geology, but of design. We have already glimpsed some strange shapes, the so-called face on Mars, the pyramid-like hills of Cydonia. Most scientists dismiss these as tricks of light and erosion, and perhaps they are. But the human eye lingers, wondering, could coincidence sometimes be memory written in stone? As each new rover trundles across the Martian surface, it sends back images of rocks, dunes, and hills. Most look ordinary, but every so often one appears that stirs the imagination. A shard that looks like a broken statue, a slab that seems too regular, too square to be chance. These may be nothing, yet in the silence of Mars, where the line between science and wonder is blurred by distance, they are enough to keep the question alive. What if civilization once walked there, before Earth had even awakened? What if Mars was the first chapter, and we are the second? By the dawn of the 21st century, Mars had become less a place of speculation and more a place of evidence. The probes, the orbiters, the rovers, they did not dream, they measured. They returned data, photographs, chemical readings. And yet, strangely, their findings only deepened the possibility that Mars was once alive, and perhaps, in some forgotten age, even civilized. One of the first mysteries to stir the public imagination came in the late 1970s, when NASA's Viking orbiter sent back images of a region known as Cydonia. Among the mesas and ridges was a formation that, in the right light, appeared eerily like a human face staring skyward, a giant visage carved or sculpted into the Martian plain. To many, it was proof too perfect, too symmetrical to be a coincidence. To scientists, it was an illusion, a trick of shadows and angles. Later, higher-resolution images showed the face to be nothing more than a lumpy hill. But the seed had been planted. Mars could look back at us, and in that gaze, we saw ourselves. Cydonia did not end the matter. Around it lay other features, pyramidal hills, sharp-sided and triangular. They too drew attention. Some argued they were natural landforms, eroded and shaped by wind. Others wondered whether they might be relics, monuments raised by hands we no longer remember. The debate has never fully died, for each new image seems to confirm both sides at once, too irregular to be surely artificial, yet too suggestive to be comfortably dismissed. As more orbiters mapped the Martian surface, they revealed a planet of staggering geological variety. Vast lava plains, craters as old as the solar system, dunes shifting and whispering winds. But among these were patterns that nagged at the imagination. Rectilinear shapes, unusual alignments, rock outcrops that seemed just faintly designed. The rational mind knew they were accidents of nature, yet the human mind, hungry for story, could not help but wonder. What would civilization look like after 1 billion years of silence? Not spires and statues, not shining cities. It would look like dust, like crumbling stone, like shadows half buried. On Earth, time erases quickly. Forests reclaim, oceans rise, mountains shift. But on Mars, things linger. The air is thin, the water gone, the ground frozen. What is left behind endures. A statue might collapse into rubble, but the rubble would remain. A wall might fall, but its line might still be visible in the sand. The memory of shape is harder to erase than the shape itself. The rovers that followed Viking gave us a closer look. Spirit and Opportunity, rolling across the plains, sent back images of scattered stones and ridges. They revealed the presence of minerals formed in water. They uncovered evidence of once wet environments, of ancient lakes where microbes might have thrived. Yet now and then, in their panoramas, an image would emerge that seemed strange. A shard with a right angle, a slab with a straight edge. Natural, surely, but evocative of ruins. Curiosity, which landed in 2012, only expanded this gallery of the uncanny. In the rocks of Gale Crater, sharp formations rose that resembled doorways or broken monuments. Scientists explained them: fractures, erosion, the slow grind of Martian winds. Yet to those who lingered on the images, they carried an unsettling familiarity. They looked less like geology and more like the aftermath of something once built. Most scientists remain firm: there is no evidence of Martian civilization. But the public imagination thrives precisely in this gap, where certainty falters, possibility blooms. And as we scroll through images beamed across millions of miles, the question persists: are we seeing nature, or are we glimpsing memory? Consider this. If humans were to vanish tomorrow, what would remain of our world after 1 million years? The great steel towers would rust and collapse. Roads would crumble. Bridges would fall. Yet certain shapes, foundations, alignments, scars upon the land might persist long after meaning had been forgotten. If aliens one day surveyed Earth, might they not argue among themselves: are these patterns the work of intention or the accidents of geology? The line between nature and design is not always easy to draw, even here at home. So too with Mars. Each photograph is a test, a mirror. Do we see only rocks, or do we see whispers of something more? Our answer may say less about Mars and more about ourselves. For if Mars truly did once harbor life, if it rose beyond microbes to culture and civilization, then we are not alone in history. We are not the first to rise, nor perhaps will we be the last to fall. In the stones of another world, we may be looking at a warning that all things pass, and that civilization itself is as fragile as water under a thinning sky. And so, with every rover image, every orbital scan, we lean forward, squinting into the dust, hoping, doubting, wondering. What lies buried on Mars? Is it only stone, or is it story? Mars today is a desert, frozen and dry, a land of dust storms and silent plains. Yet everywhere we look, the evidence of water is written into its skin. The planet is a palimpsest, an old manuscript where the ink of ancient rivers still bleeds faintly through the pages of dust. And in those rivers, lakes and seas, we see the outline of a possibility: that once, long ago, Mars was a world capable not only of life, but of flourishing. Scientists now believe that billions of years ago, Mars may have held vast oceans in its northern hemisphere. Shorelines can be traced along the edges of plains. Sedimentary deposits suggest the action of waves and tides. Imagine it, a blue Mars, its seas sparkling under a younger sun, clouds drifting across a sky denser and warmer than today. To us, it is almost unimaginable, a vision of a planet alive not only with stone, but with water. If there were oceans, then Mars would have had climates, weather, cycles of rain and evaporation. Lakes would have filled craters, rivers would have snaked through valleys, deltas would have fanned across lowlands. It would have been, in every way, a world that mirrored our own. And in that reflection, the door to life swings open. Here on Earth, wherever water lingers, life takes root. In hot springs, in polar ice, in the darkest oceans, life persists. It needs little encouragement, only opportunity. If Mars truly possessed oceans, then it too had opportunity. Perhaps not just for simple life, but for something more. Consider how civilization arose on Earth. It was not in the forests or the mountains, but along rivers: the Nile, the Tigris, The Indus. Where water flowed, people gathered. Where water gathered, cities grew. If Mars had its own rivers, its own fertile valleys, could it not have hosted the same pattern? Civilization rising from the water's edge, using rivers as roads, seas as highways, building culture along the banks of life itself. Of course, this remains speculation, but speculation does not arise in a vacuum. It is rooted in evidence, evidence that grows stronger each year. NASA's rovers have uncovered ancient lake beds, clay deposits formed in water, salt minerals that point to evaporation. Orbital maps reveal valleys that could only have been carved by following streams. Even the colors of Martian rock whisper of chemistry altered by the presence of water. But then comes the question, what happened? If Mars was once blue, how did it become red? The answer lies in its fragility. Smaller than Earth, with weaker gravity, Mars struggled to hold onto its atmosphere. Over time, the solar wind stripped it bare. Without a protective shield, its oceans evaporated into space, leaving behind only traces. What was once fertile became arid. What was once alive became silent. And yet here lies the haunting possibility. If Mars had oceans for hundreds of millions of years, was that long enough? Long enough for life to spark, to grow, to reach beyond survival and into culture? On Earth, life began almost as soon as conditions allowed. Civilization, too, emerged more quickly than once thought, rising soon after the end of the last ice age. Perhaps Mars, pressed by urgency, found its own path in the brief window it was given. If so, where are the signs? They may lie at the bottom of vanished seas, buried beneath sediments. They may linger in the frozen ground as fossils awaiting discovery. Or they may be gone, erased by time, leaving only hints in the geometry of stone and the chemistry of soil. Civilization leaves scars, but scars can fade. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Mars, that even worlds can change beyond recognition, that oceans can vanish, skies can thin, and civilizations, if they ever existed, can crumble to dust. Mars is a mirror of impermanence, a reminder that nothing endures forever, not even planets. Yet we cannot turn away. The idea grips us, pulls us forward. For to admit the possibility of a Martian civilization is to admit something larger, that we are not the only story, and that the universe is older, richer, and more fragile than we imagine. Mars holds its secrets in silence. Oceans turn to memory. But one truth remains. Where there was water, there was possibility. And where there was possibility, there may once have been civilization. If Mars once held oceans, rivers, and lakes, then it must also have held shorelines, beaches, and beds of sediment where the traces of life could be preserved. On Earth, such places are treasure troves of fossils. In shallow seas and muddy deltas, the remains of organisms sink, are buried, and slowly turn to stone. Through fossils, we can read the history of life like pages in a book. If Mars had life, might it too have written such a book beneath its sands? For decades, scientists have debated this tantalizing question. The search for fossils on Mars is not merely science, it is archaeology on a planetary scale.
The difficulty, of course, is that fossils are rare even on Earth where life is abundant. They require special conditions, rapid burial, mineral-rich waters, low oxygen. On Mars, the odds are slimmer, yet not impossible. Indeed, some Martian rocks display layering, rippling, and formations that resemble those of ancient lake beds on Earth, prime locations for fossilization. The closest we have come to an answer came in 1996. That year, a Martian meteorite known as ALH 84001 found in Antarctica was studied in detail. Within its crystals were strange structures, tiny worm-like shapes that some scientists argued were fossilized bacteria. The announcement was explosive. The President of the United States even addressed the nation, declaring that we might have found evidence of life beyond Earth. For a moment, the world believed. But science is cautious, and skepticism soon followed. Others argued that the shapes could have been produced by natural chemical processes, not biology. The debate has never been fully resolved. The meteorite remains a riddle, fossil or chemistry, life or illusion. Yet even in uncertainty, its lesson is clear. The possibility of Martian fossils cannot be dismissed.
In recent years, rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance have been tasked with exactly this hunt. They carry instruments capable of analyzing rock layers, detecting organic molecules, and even selecting samples to one day return to Earth. They explore dried-up river deltas and ancient lake beds, searching not for cities or canals, but for the tiniest traces of past life. A single fossil, even a microscopic one, would change everything. And here the question expands. If fossils were found, what would they reveal? Would they show only microbes, simple, hardy pioneers clinging to wet stone? Or would they suggest something more complex, organisms with tissues, structures, perhaps even societies of their own? For civilization requires more than individuals. It requires cooperation, communication, the weaving of lives into something greater. Fossils may never show us this directly, but they might hint at complexity, at ecosystems that grew dense enough to support something beyond mere survival. Skeptics argue that civilization on Mars is a fantasy, that at best we might find evidence of bacteria or algae. But to others, the possibility is worth considering. For civilization too leaves fossils, not of bone, but of culture, carvings, artifacts, structures. If such things existed on Mars, they may not yet have been found. They may lie buried beneath meters of dust, waiting for the slow tread of exploration to uncover them. Imagine for a moment what such a discovery would mean. A fossilized skeleton, not of a microbe, but of something larger. An imprint in stone that suggests limbs, movement, perhaps even tools. It would not simply prove that life existed, it would prove that Mars once held beings who might have thought, created, remembered. The odds are long, but the reward is immeasurable. For in fossils, we do not merely see shapes in stone. We see echoes of existence. We see proof that life does not belong solely to Earth. And even if all we find are microbes, even if civilization remains only speculation, it is enough to remind us of something profound. Life is not an accident of Earth, but a potential of worlds. Mars may hold no cities, no monuments, but in its fossils it may hold whispers of what once was. Thus the fossil question lingers, as sharp and unresolved as ever. Did Mars write its history in stone, as Earth has done? And if so, are we willing to dig deep enough to read it? Civilization, if it ever existed on Mars,
would not reveal itself only through fossils or ancient bones. It would also leave traces of technology, artifacts, tools, structures. On Earth, even the oldest human societies are remembered through stone circles, flint blades, pottery shards. What, then, might a Martian civilization have left behind? The challenge is daunting. Mars is a world billions of years old. Any civilization would have risen and fallen in the deep past, long before our own species walked the Earth. Time is relentless. Metals corrode, wood decay, fabrics vanish. Even here on Earth, civilizations thousands of years old are often reduced to fragments. After millions, even billions of years, what could possibly survive? And yet, stone endures. Geometry endures. Alignments of structures, foundations carved into bedrock, shapes too regular to be explained by chance. These are the ghosts of technology that can persist. On Mars, where wind and dust are the primary forces of erosion, such remnants might last far longer than they would on Earth. Already, orbiters have photographed features that stir this very debate. Rectangular patterns on crater floors, blocks of rock that appear aligned, almost architectural, hills shaped in ways that, to the human eye, resemble pyramids or monuments. Science explains them as geology, the natural play of erosion and fracture, but imagination whispers, could some of these shapes be the last echoes of intention? The so-called doorway, photographed by Curiosity in 2022, is a perfect example. A small gap in rock, resembling a carved entrance, captured the public's imagination. NASA quickly clarified it was a fracture, no more than a foot tall, produced by natural stresses. But the image spread across the world, for in it people saw not geology, but design. Not nature, but culture. This tension between what science confirms and what imagination craves lies at the heart of the Martian question. If there were technology on Mars, we might mistake it for geology. And if there is only geology, we might mistake it for technology. The eye longs to find pattern, and the dust offers just enough suggestion to keep the debate alive. But let us consider the possibility in earnest. If Mars had civilization, what kind of technology might it have produced? Not the gleaming towers of science fiction, nor spacecraft capable of spanning the stars. More likely, it would resemble our earliest stages, structures of stone, tools fashioned from what the land provided. Civilization does not begin with grandeur. It begins with survival, with ingenuity carved out of necessity. Perhaps Martian engineers built aqueducts to channel water before the atmosphere thinned. Perhaps they raised shelters against dust storms, or monuments to mark the cycles of their skies. Perhaps they left inscriptions in stone, languages we could never decipher, but whose presence would nonetheless proclaim, "We were here." And perhaps, if their technology advanced further, they left behind devices stranger still. Machines rusted to nothing, reactors gone cold, signals that once pulsed into the void but now lie silent. The desert of Mars might be littered with ruins invisible to our eyes, buried beneath dunes or shattered by impacts. To find them would require not only exploration, but patience, archaeology on a planetary scale. Skeptics argue, rightly, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A square rock is not a city. A doorway-shaped crack is not a palace. But history reminds us that discovery often begins with doubt. The ruins of Troy were once dismissed as myth. The fossils of dinosaurs were once thought to be legends carved in stone. Might Mars conceal a similar surprise? If technology ever bloomed there, then Mars carries its memory, even if faint. A shard, a foundation, a single artifact could transform speculation into history. Until then, we remain in the space between, uncertain but listening. For if we were to find technology on Mars, even the simplest trace, it would force us to rewrite the story of civilization itself. We would no longer see ourselves as unique, but as part of a wider chorus. One world's rise, another's fall. One species still alive, another long gone. Technology is memory made durable. And if Mars once had it, then the planet is more than a desert. It is a museum of silence, waiting for us to open its doors.
If civilization ever existed on Mars, when might it have flourished? To answer this, we must piece together the planet's history, not in decades or centuries, but in eons. Mars is old, older than almost every trace of civilization on Earth. Its surface tells a tale written in dust and stone, and from that tale we can begin to sketch a timeline. 4 billion years ago, Mars was young. Its surface was restless, its volcanoes alive. Great plumes of magma built Olympus Mons and its neighbors, while water, thick and abundant, carved valleys and filled basins. This was the Noachian period, named after Noah, for it was a world of floods. During this era, Mars was most Earth-like, a denser atmosphere, a magnetic field, rivers flowing freely across plains. If life were ever to arise, this was its cradle. By contrast, Earth at that time was still in turmoil. Oceans boiled beneath a harsher sun. Impacts scarred the surface, and life, if it had begun, remained microscopic. Mars, smaller and quicker to cool, may have stabilized earlier. If so, it might have given rise to life sooner than Earth. In that sense, Mars could have been our older sibling, beginning the story first. Civilization, of course, does not spring from microbes alone. It requires time, evolution, ecosystems. But if Mars had a head start of hundreds of millions of years, could it have reached complexity before Earth had even stabilized? The possibility is unsettling, for it suggests that civilization is not a unique product of Earth's timeline, but something that might arise wherever conditions allow. The story continues into the Hesperian period, around 3.7 to 3 billion years ago. Mars was drying. Volcanoes still rumbled, but the rivers were fading. Catastrophic floods scoured the land, leaving behind channels vast enough to be seen from orbit. It was a time of transition, a planet losing its water, its air, its habitability. If civilization arose here, it would have been pressed by urgency. Survival would demand adaptation to a world slipping away. Finally came the Amazonian period, stretching from 3 billion years ago to the present. This is the Mars we know. Cold, thin air, water retreating underground, dust storms sweeping across barren plains. If civilization survived into this era, it would have faced collapse. Its cities, if any, would crumble. Its people, if any, would fade into extinction. The traces of their presence would be swallowed by dust, scattered by meteors, or buried under the sands of time. This timeline reveals something profound. If there was civilization on Mars, it would not have been contemporary with ours. It would have been ancient,
so ancient that the distance between us and them is not in miles, but in epochs. They would be as distant from us as we are from the first single-celled life on Earth. Their rise and fall would have occurred long before we appeared. And so the Martian timeline reframes the question. We are not searching for neighbors, but for ancestors, not in blood, but in the story of intelligence. We are asking whether Mars wrote a chapter of civilization billions of years before Earth took up the pen. The implications ripple outward. If Mars once hosted civilization, then intelligence is not a fluke. It is a pattern, one that can appear quickly under the right conditions. It would mean that the universe is not empty of minds, but filled with them, scattered across time as well as space. But it also carries a warning, for Mars lost what we still have. Its skies thinned, its oceans vanished, its warmth fled. If civilization stood there once, it fell, not because of war or folly, but because its world changed. And if it happened there, could it not one day happen here? Thus, the Martian timeline is not only a scientific curiosity, it is a mirror. It shows us not only what may have been, but what could still be. If Mars once nurtured civilization, then its silence today speaks louder than any monument. It tells a story of fragility, a reminder that even worlds are not eternal. To study Mars is not simply to ask whether it had life, but to ask why it no longer does. And in that question, we find lessons that may shape the fate of our own species. Civilizations fall. On Earth, history is filled with ruins. Mayan temples swallowed by jungle, Mesopotamian cities buried under desert sands, Roman roads crumbling to dust. Each fall is tragic, yet each is local. The planet continues. But on Mars, if there was collapse, it was total. It was not the end of a city, nor even of a culture, but the end of a world's capacity to sustain civilization at all. Why did it happen? The answer lies not in war or famine, but in physics. Mars is small. With only a third of Earth's gravity, it could not hold on to a thick atmosphere forever. Once its magnetic field faded, the solar wind stripped its skies. Oceans evaporated, rivers dried, and the climate shifted from temperate to brutal. If there was civilization, it faced a slow suffocation. No invention, no ingenuity could prevent the loss of air and water. The lesson here is stark. Civilization is not only fragile, it is planetary. It depends not just on culture and technology, but on the stability of the world beneath its feet. On Earth, we take our oceans, our atmosphere, our climate for granted. Yet Mars reminds us that these can be temporary. A civilization may thrive for millennia, only to be undone not by its own mistakes, but by the shifting balance of nature. And yet, there is another lesson. Mars shows us endurance. Though its surface is barren, its memory persists. The traces of water remain. The shapes of valleys, the layering of sediments, the chemistry of rocks, all testify to a time when it was alive. Even if civilization there has been erased, the planet itself remembers. It whispers across billions of years, "We were once like you." For us, this whisper is both haunting and galvanizing. It tells us that we are not alone in fragility. It tells us that survival is not guaranteed. But it also tells us that memory can endure. that even if we one day fall, the Earth itself will bear witness to our time. Perhaps the greatest lesson of Mars is humility. We are not the first to ask these questions, nor will we be the last. If Mars once had a civilization, it did not last forever, and neither perhaps will we. But by studying its silence, we may learn how to extend our own voice, how to build resilience against the forces that shape worlds. In the end, the ruins of Mars may not be cities or monuments. They may be warnings, etched in dust and stone. Warnings that say life is precious, civilization is brief, and planets themselves can betray those who dwell upon them. Mars, in its silence, is both a grave and a guide. If it once knew civilization, then its loss is not only tragedy, but wisdom, a wisdom we ignore at our peril. Archaeology on Earth begins with a spade in the soil, a brush on stone, the slow unearthing of lost worlds hidden beneath layers of time. But on Mars, archaeology takes on a different form. Here the soil is dust, millions of years deep. The ruins, if any exist, are not beneath jungles or deserts, but beneath the thin veil of an alien atmosphere. To search for civilization on Mars is not to dig, but to look. Our tools are rovers and orbiters, cameras and spectrometers. They sweep across the surface, pixel by pixel, frame by frame, recording landscapes more vast than any empire. And yet, what they find is always ambiguous. A rock with sharp edges, a shadow cast just so. These could be ruins, or they could be nature's accidents. Unlike Earth, where a pot or a wall is unmistakable, on Mars, every clue is cloaked in doubt. This makes Martian archaeology less a science of discovery and more a science of patience. Each image must be studied, each anomaly debated. Does that alignment mean design, or is it chance? Does that slab bear marks of tools or cracks of geology? The line between artifact and accident is razor-thin, and the silence of Mars offers no easy answers. But silence itself can be evidence. On Earth, absence can be telling. The empty chambers of Pompeii speak as loudly as its mosaics. The gaps in our fossil record tell us where to look next. On Mars, the silence of technology, of tools, of monuments, it too tells a story. Perhaps there was no civilization, or perhaps there was, but time has smothered every trace. And here lies the paradox of Martian archaeology. If we find nothing, it does not prove absence. It may only prove the cruelty of time. Stone weathers, dust buries, impacts shatter. Civilization may have existed and been erased, leaving us to puzzle over hints too faint to interpret. Yet hope remains, for even silence leaves patterns. A vanished civilization might not give us walls or weapons, but it might give us anomalies, regularities in stone, alignments in terrain, chemical signatures in soil. Already some features demand our attention. Rectilinear ridges that stretch too neatly across the land, magnetic anomalies that suggest something buried beneath the surface, strange deposits of minerals where no simple process should have placed them. The work ahead is slow. We cannot yet dig trenches on Mars, nor sift its sands by hand. But with each rover, each mission, we refine our eyes. Perseverance now carries tools to search directly for biosignatures, subtle chemical traces of life itself. Future missions may one day carry drills deep enough to reach what the surface cannot tell. Until then, we sift through silence. We treat Mars not as a museum with exhibits on display, but as a library of lost pages, many torn, many blank. We search for footnotes where the main text has been erased, and as we do, we must remember this. Archaeology is never only about the past. It is about us, about how we see ourselves in the ruins of others. On Mars, our questions reveal more than our answers. We ask whether there was civilization not only because of evidence, but because of desire. We want to know if we are unique, or if we are one among many voices in a cosmic choir. The archaeology of silence, then, is not only a science, it is a meditation, a recognition that some answers may never come, but the asking itself has meaning. To search the dust of Mars is to search the edges of our own identity. And in that search, even silence is eloquent. For most of human history, we gazed at Mars through telescopes and imagined canals, cities, even forests. Today, the view is sharper, but the imagination persists. Instead of sketching lines on maps, we now pore over gigabytes of data from rovers and orbiters. Yet even in this age of high resolution, the shadows remain. They are no longer tricks of the eye, but ambiguities in the data, patterns that hover between nature and design. Take the recurring slope linear, dark streaks that appear seasonally on Martian hillsides. To some, they suggest briny water seeping to the surface, perhaps even nurturing microbial colonies. To others, they are dry dust flows, nothing more. Yet the possibility lingers. Might life still flicker, however faintly, in these hidden rivulets? Then there are the curious shapes caught in rover images. A stone with angles too straight, a formation resembling a doorway, a shard that looks like a fragment of machinery. NASA and planetary geologists explain them, patiently, as natural processes, fractures, erosion, shadows. But the public imagination resists. Each anomaly becomes a window into what if, a suggestion that the surface hides more than it reveals. Digital archaeology has emerged as a strange new discipline in this search. Volunteers across the world scan through thousands of Martian images, circling shapes they deem unusual. They are citizen explorers, sifting dust with pixels rather than shovels. Some discoveries are dismissed, others spark debate, and always the question remains, how would we know if we saw civilization? What would make us certain? For the truth is this: evidence is slippery. A fossil may be dismissed as a mineral deposit. A ruin may be explained as geology. Only overwhelming, repeatable proof would silence doubt. Until then, every image is a Rorschach test, reflecting our hopes as much as Mars itself. And yet, hope has its uses. It keeps eyes fixed on the data, compels us to keep looking, keeps the conversation alive. The shadows in the data may not yet tell us what Mars was, but they remind us that the story is unfinished. In the end, these ambiguities are less about deception and more about perspective. Mars is a vast alien canvas, and we are only beginning to learn how to read it. The shadows are not answers, but invitations, inviting us to sharpen our tools, refine our eyes, and above all, to keep asking questions. For in those questions lies the heart of discovery. Science thrives on uncertainty, on the space between what is known and what is possible. The shadows in the data may conceal ruins, or they may conceal nothing at all. But until we land, dig, and see with our own hands, they will continue to haunt us, whispering possibilities from every pixel. When we ask whether there was a civilization on Mars, we are not only asking about Mars, we are asking about ourselves. Civilization is not merely a material reality. It is a mirror of values, of choices, of survival. To imagine Martian civilization is to imagine what culture might look like under different skies, shaped by different challenges. On Earth, culture was born from abundance and adversity alike. Rivers offered harvests, mountains offered protection, deserts tested endurance. Mars, by contrast, was a harsher parent. Its air was thin, its climate colder, its resources scarcer. If civilization arose there, it must have been forged in struggle, every shelter built against the dust, every tool a defense against the cold. Where we built cathedrals and amphitheaters, they may have built only what necessity allowed. And yet, culture is more than survival. Even in scarcity, humans painted caves, carved statues, sang songs. Might Martians have done the same? Did they mark their stones with art? Did they record their stories in patterns, in carvings, in structures meant to endure? Or was their culture less visual, rooted in oral traditions, in ceremonies, in fleeting expressions lost to time? This is where imagination becomes archaeology of the mind, for even without evidence, we can learn by reflection. By asking what culture on Mars might have been, we see more clearly what our own culture is. We realize how deeply it depends on environment, on opportunity, on the chance gifts of our planet. Consider architecture. On Earth, civilizations used stone, clay, timber, metal. On Mars, timber would not exist and metal would be scarce. Stone would dominate, as it has in deserts on Earth. But stone under thin air and weaker gravity could allow for shapes impossible here. Vaults wider, pillars taller. Martian architecture, if it existed, may have been monumental not for glory, but for necessity.
Or consider language. On Earth, spoken words spread across air dense enough to carry them. On Mars, sound would travel poorly. Did Martians develop other modes of communication? Visual signals, vibrations through stone, signs rather than speech. Civilization adapts not only to land, but to air. Their culture, if it ever flourished, may have been less audible, more visible. And then there is belief. Earthly civilizations looked to the skies and saw gods, patterns, destinies. On Mars, the sky is red, the storms immense, the stars sharp in the thin night air. What myths might arise under such a dome? What stories would they tell of the twin worlds, Earth bright and blue, Mars dim and red, hanging side by side? Did they wonder if they were alone, as we now wonder about them? In this way, the question of Martian civilization becomes less speculation and more reflection. Even without evidence, we learn by comparison. Mars is a cultural mirror, showing us what civilization might mean in a universe not made for us. Perhaps this is the greatest gift of the idea, not proof of another culture, but perspective on our own. By imagining the lives of others, real or hypothetical, we come to value the fragility, creativity, and resilience of our own lives more deeply. For whether or not Mars ever sang its own songs, carved its own monuments, or told its own myths, it invites us to ask what culture truly is. And in asking, we discover something timeless, that civilization is not defined by what it leaves behind, but by the fact that it dared to exist at all.
If Mars once hosted civilization, another question inevitably follows. Did they ever see us? Did they ever know that Earth existed, that another world spun close by under the same sun? On Earth, ancient peoples looked to the sky and wondered about Mars. They traced its wandering path, naming it after gods of war and fire. But what of Mars itself? If there was a people there, would they not have looked upward too? Would Earth, pale and blue, have hung in their night sky as a mystery, just as Mars once was to us? Contact between worlds is not easy. Even today, with rockets and radio, the gulf is vast. For a civilization on Mars, the challenge would have been greater. Their atmosphere was thin, their resources few, their world already slipping into decline. Yet imagination tempts us. Could signals have crossed the void long before our radios? Could light itself have been used, flashes from mountaintops or fires, messages written in the stars? It is a romantic image, but contact does not always require technology. It may be enough simply to look, to wonder. On Earth, the thought of other worlds shaped myth and philosophy. On Mars, the sight of Earth may have done the same. Perhaps they dreamt of reaching us, as we dream of reaching them. Perhaps they told stories of the blue star that promised abundance, a mirror of their own fading world. But what if contact was more than dreaming? Could a Martian civilization, advanced enough, have sent explorers to Earth in the deep past? The idea is bold, almost outrageous. Yet in the scale of billions of years, who can say what journeys were possible? Fossils on Earth may not only tell our story, they may hold traces of others, visitors from a time before history began. There is another possibility, quieter yet equally profound, that we are, in some sense, the contact. Some theories suggest that life may have traveled between planets, hitching rides on meteorites thrown into space by impacts. If Martian microbes seeded Earth, then civilization here is, in part, their legacy. In that way, contact was not across space, but across time. We may not only be their descendants, we may be their continuation. The question of contact is haunting because it cuts both ways. If they reached us, what did they find? If they looked, what did they see? And if they fell into silence, why did they not endure? Their absence is itself a message, as clear as any radio signal. Survival is fragile, even across worlds. Yet contact need not be real to be meaningful. Even as speculation, it draws us closer to them. We imagine their eyes on the same sky, their thoughts wandering to Earth as ours wandered to Mars. Across the gulf of time and silence, we share a kinship. Two worlds bound by curiosity, by the desire not to be alone. In the end, the question of contact may never be answered, but perhaps the answer matters less than the asking. For to ask is to imagine, and to imagine is to bridge the distance. In that sense, contact has already happened, here, in our minds, as we wonder about them.
If there was ever civilization on Mars, one fact is undeniable. It is gone. The red planet today is barren, silent, stripped of seas and air. The question is not only whether they existed, but why they no longer do. Extinction on a planetary scale is a riddle with many possible answers, and each one carries lessons for us. The first theory is environmental collapse. Mars, as we know, lost its magnetic field billions of years ago.
Without that shield, the solar wind stripped its atmosphere, thinning it until oceans boiled away and rivers retreated underground. For any civilization, this would have been catastrophic. Imagine building farms, homes in cities, only to watch the very air fade from the sky. Survival would require desperate adaptation. Technologies to seal habitats, mines to reach water, perhaps even attempts to leave the planet altogether. In the end, though, the forces of physics may have been too great. Civilization may have perished not through failure, but through inevitability. A second theory is cosmic disaster. Mars bears scars of impacts on a scale we can scarcely imagine. Craters hundreds of kilometers wide testify to collisions with asteroids and comets. On Earth, one such impact ended the reign of the dinosaurs. On Mars, a similar blow could have extinguished not just a species, but an entire civilization, wiping out its centers and scattering survivors into decline. The third theory is self-destruction. On Earth, we know the fragility of balance, how easily conflict, overpopulation, or misuse of resources can lead to collapse. If Mars had civilization, it too may have faced the dangers of its own ingenuity. Wars fought over dwindling water, technologies pushed beyond control, environmental damage accelerated by exploitation. In this sense, Mars may not be alien at all, but familiar, a mirror of our own vulnerabilities. Another possibility is migration. Perhaps they did not perish, but left. Faced with a dying planet, perhaps they sought refuge underground, or even across space. Did they burrow into caverns, eking out a survival unseen by us? Did they launch vessels, crude or advanced, seeking new homes? Could traces of them linger still, hidden in places we have not looked? And then there is the most haunting theory of all, that they never existed, that Mars was always empty of civilization, its silence not the result of loss, but of absence. In this view, the planet teaches not through memory, but through contrast. It shows us a path not taken, a reminder of how rare civilization may truly be. Yet even this is a kind of extinction, the extinction of possibility, of a story that might have been, but never was. Each theory leaves us with a message. Environmental collapse warns us of planetary fragility. Cosmic disaster warns us of chance. Self-destruction warns us of ourselves. Migration tempts us with the idea of legacy, a survival we have yet to confirm. And absence reminds us to treasure the uniqueness of what we have. In the end, the extinction of Martian civilization, whether real or imagined, is not only about them, it is about us. For their fate, whatever it was, is a possible echo of our own. By studying Mars, we are not only asking whether they lived, but whether we can continue to. If Mars once supported civilization, then perhaps its story is not finished. Above ground, the planet is barren. Winds scour the plains, dust storms sweep across valleys, and the air is too thin to breathe. But below the surface, that is another matter. There, beneath layers of dust and rock, lies the possibility of survival. On Earth, life often retreats underground when the surface becomes hostile. Microbes thrive in caves, shielded from ultraviolet light. Entire ecosystems flourish around geothermal vents, far below the reach of the sun. If a Martian civilization once faced extinction, perhaps they too sought refuge in the depths. Mars offers some intriguing hints. Networks of lava tubes, formed by ancient volcanic flows, stretch for kilometers beneath the surface. These natural caverns, larger than any on Earth due to Mars's lower gravity, could provide shelter from radiation, dust storms, and temperature extremes. If ever there was a refuge for civilization, this would be it. Imagine entire communities hidden in colossal caverns, their walls glowing with artificial light sustained by underground water and geothermal heat. Our instruments, too, suggest secrets below. Radar scans from orbit have detected layers that may be ice or even liquid water beneath the polar caps. Other signals hint at strange reflections, possibilities of underground lakes. Where there is water, even briny, there may be life. And if life could persist, might not remnants of a civilization do the same?
Science remains cautious. The evidence for subsurface water is debated, and there is no direct sign of structures or technology. Yet the hypothesis remains alluring. If a people on Mars faced catastrophe, would they not dig? Would they not turn to the ground itself as their final sanctuary? This idea sparks a deeper thought. What if they are still there? Not alive in the sense we imagine, a bustling society of cities and machines, but alive in traces, artifacts entombed in rock, fossils of beings adapted to the dark, languages etched into cavern walls. The underground may not preserve the living, but it can preserve memory. Exploration of this kind is still ahead of us. Our rovers scratch only the surface, their drills shallow. To reach the depths would require missions yet to come, machines able to bore through ice, to descend into caves, to search for what the dust has hidden. Until then, the underground remains a locked chamber, its secrets sealed. But the idea lingers, powerful and unsettling. If we one day descend into those Martian caverns and find remnants of a civilization, what would it mean? Would we see them as ancestors, as strangers, as warnings? Would their story change ours? Or would it remind us that survival requires constant adaptation, even to the harshest of worlds? Perhaps the underground of Mars is empty. Perhaps it is filled only with stone and silence. But perhaps it is not. Perhaps beneath the cold plains, in caverns untouched for eons, lies the final chapter of a civilization that refused to surrender to the sky. Even politics would not escape. Nations would rush to claim authority over the find, to control access, to shape the narrative. Who owns the ruins of Mars? Who speaks for a civilization that can no longer speak for itself? The question would test our unity as surely as it tests our imagination. And then there is the personal shock, the way it would change how we wake each morning, how we look at the sky. To know that another people once lived under that red horizon, dreamed their own dreams, faced their own struggles. It would be impossible to look at Mars as we once did. The planet would no longer be just a destination. It would be a memory, a story, a mirror. In this way, the discovery of civilization on Mars would be less about them and more about us. It would force us to ask, what does it mean to be human if humanity is not alone in its capacity for civilization? What responsibilities do we bear as the living heirs of a universe capable of thought and culture? The shock would fade, as all shocks do, but its echo would remain, reshaping science, belief, and identity for generations.
Mars would no longer be silent. It would speak, not with words, but with the simple fact of its past. And in that fact, we would find both humility and hope.
The discovery of a Martian civilization would not be a conclusion, it would be a beginning. With proof in hand that we are not the first, humanity's path forward would inevitably change. Every choice about space, science, and even survival would carry new weight. First, colonization. For decades, Mars has been imagined as humanity's next home, a place where domes might rise above the dust, where pioneers might build a new frontier. But if we uncover ruins, those ambitions would be tested. Would Mars remain simply a resource for us to mine, or would it become something else, an archaeological site, a planetary heritage? Colonization would no longer be only about survival, it would be about respect. To live on Mars would mean living alongside its past. Second, unity. The shock of discovery might bring humanity together, even if only briefly. Borders, ideologies, rivalries, these might seem smaller when we realize that another civilization once shared our solar system. We would see ourselves not as nations, but as a species, carrying forward a story that is larger than any single flag. Whether that unity lasts is uncertain, but the possibility alone could reshape global politics. Third, responsibility. If civilizations can vanish, then so can ours. Mars would be a cautionary tale written in dust. Every ruin would remind us of fragility, of how quickly abundance can fade. Perhaps in seeing what was lost, we would learn to value what we still have, our oceans, our forests, our skies. Perhaps we would think more carefully about the choices that could one day strip Earth as bare as Mars. But there is also hope. A Martian civilization, even if extinct, would prove that intelligence is not confined to one world. If it has happened twice here, it can happen countless times elsewhere. That knowledge would expand our destiny beyond imagination. We would no longer ask if we are alone, but how many neighbors the cosmos might hold. This would fuel exploration with new urgency. Telescopes would scan for exoplanets, not only for science, but for kinship. Missions to Europa, Enceladus, Titan, worlds once seen as speculative, would become imperatives. If Mars had civilization, then where else might it have bloomed, waiting for us to discover? Even art and culture would be transformed. Writers, musicians, and thinkers would weave the story of two civilizations into our shared mythology. Mars would no longer be just a red dot in the sky. It would be a companion, a reminder that civilization is not singular, but part of a larger cosmic rhythm. And perhaps the most profound shift would be in our sense of purpose. For too long, humanity has been torn between survival and conflict, between creation and destruction. The discovery of a Martian civilization could offer a new horizon, the responsibility to carry forward not only our story, but theirs, to become the custodians of civilization itself across worlds. In that way, Mars would change us, not by offering a place to escape, but by offering a lesson, a reminder that the universe allows civilization but does not guarantee its permanence. Our destiny would no longer be merely earthly, it would be Martian as well. And in that shared destiny, we might finally find the courage to endure. Not all revolutions happen in laboratories or governments. Some happen quietly, in living rooms, in schools, in the solitary moments when ordinary people look up at the night sky. The discovery of a Martian civilization, whether through ruins, artifacts, or fossils, would reach far beyond science. It would touch the human heart.
For children, the story would be transformative. Textbooks would change overnight, classrooms filled with wonder at the idea that another people once lived just next door. No longer would Mars be only a planet of dust and rocks, it would be a world of history, a place where stories unfolded long before our own began. For a new generation, imagination would have no bounds. For believers of faith, the news would cut deeply, though in different ways. Some would see it as affirmation, a sign that creation is vast, that life is woven through the cosmos by design. Others would struggle, questioning what it means for humanity's place in the divine order. Temples and churches, mosques and synagogues would echo with new debates, as ancient texts were reread through the lens of Martian civilization. Artists and storytellers, too, would feel the change. Painters would capture the red plains as never before. Poets would craft verses about two civilizations divided by silence. Musicians would compose symphonies to echo across the void. Every gallery, every library, every stage would find new inspiration in the knowledge that civilization is not singular, but plural. For some, the discovery would bring joy. Loneliness would lift. No longer would humanity be the sole voice in the universe, crying into the dark. We would know that others once spoke, even if their voices are now gone. To be one among many, even across time, is to feel less alone. But for others, the news would bring fear. If they vanished, why not us? If a world so close once fell silent, what guarantees our own survival? For those already burdened by anxiety about climate, war, or collapse, Mars would be a mirror reflecting their worst fears. Civilization, they would realize, is fragile everywhere. And yet, fragility is not futility. To face the silence of Mars is to be reminded of the preciousness of Earth. Parents may look at their children differently, aware of how thin the thread of continuity can be. Farmers may look at their soil with more reverence, knowing how quickly it could be lost. Ordinary lives, ordinary choices, might carry new weight, grounded in the knowledge that everything can vanish, and that this makes everything more meaningful. Perhaps the greatest impact would be this: empathy. To know that another civilization lived and died is to know that we are not alone in our struggles. The joys, the fears, the triumphs and mistakes of Martians, whatever they were, become reflections of our own. Their silence becomes our responsibility, their memory our inheritance. The human heart would never be the same. Each time we glance at the red planet, we would not see only stone and dust, we would see neighbors, predecessors, kin. And in that recognition, we would discover something timeless: that civilization, wherever it blooms, is not just a fact of survival. It is a song of existence, fragile yet enduring, written across the stars. In the end, the question of a Martian civilization is not only about Mars, it is about us. Whether ruins lie beneath its dust, or whether its silence has always been, the red planet has already changed the way we think about civilization, survival, and meaning. If there was once life there, thinking, building, dreaming, then their echoes remind us that we are not the first, and we may not be the last. If there was not, then their absence still speaks, a reminder of how rare, how fragile, and how precious our existence truly is. In both cases, Mars is a mirror. It shows us possibility, but also consequence. For Earth, the lesson is both sobering and hopeful. Civilization is not guaranteed. It depends on balance, between planet and people, between nature and invention, between hope and humility. Mars may be a warning, showing us what happens when balance is lost, but it may also be an inspiration, showing us that life and intelligence are not confined to one world alone. The legacy of a Martian civilization, real or imagined, lies in what it teaches us to value. It tells us to look after our atmosphere, our oceans, our soil. It tells us to look beyond conflict, to build not only for today, but for tomorrow. And above all, it tells us to endure, not only for ourselves, but for the story of civilization itself. For if we fall, then like Mars, our planet will remember us only in silence. But if we endure, if we adapt, if we learn, then perhaps one day another world will look to Earth and see not only a ruin, but a beacon. They will know that we carried forward a story larger than our own, a story shared across planets, a story written in the language of survival and wonder. Mars, in its quietness, asks us one final question. What kind of legacy will we leave? A memory of collapse or a testament of endurance? The answer lies not in the stars, but here, in the choices we make. And so we return to where we began, gazing at the red planet, its face scarred yet timeless, its silence both haunting and profound. Was it once alive with civilization? Perhaps. Was it once silent, as it is now? Perhaps. Either way, it speaks to us. It tells us that life is possible, that civilization is fragile, that survival is a story always unfinished. The echoes across time are faint, but they are enough to remind us that we are part of something greater, a cosmos that is not empty, but waiting for voices, for stories, for civilizations to rise, to fall, and to be remembered. The question of Mars may never be fully answered, but in asking it, we become more than what we were. We become custodians of civilization, bearers of its fragile flame, guardians of its story across time and stars. Mars is silent, but we are not. And as long as we endure, the song of civilization continues, echoing across worlds.